Between the years of 1995 and 2002, there were a total of 38 horror games released on the original PlayStation, with 23 of those being first installments in new franchises. Then, between the years 2000 and 2009, we saw at least 52 horror games released onto the PlayStation 2, likely more, with roughly 14 of those being new IP. Alright, that all sounds pretty good. What about the PS3? Okay, no, there were some horror games released on the PlayStation 3. However, there weren't many, and it turned out to be a very strange era for the genre as a whole, and one that I was inspired to look more into after finding out just how little the console had to offer in terms of horror. But remember, I'm not an expert, if there is such a thing, and this is by no means supposed to be a definitive documentation of events. I'm just a dude who had a lot of questions and documented my journey in finding the answers. So if I got something wrong, let me know in the comments. Welcome to Mortuary Gaming, the channel where I dig up the buried bodies of yesteryear's horror games, give you a review and as much information and development history as I can possibly find. I am currently playing through and reviewing every PS1 and PS2 horror game ever released, so if that sounds interesting to you, please throw me a like and a sub, check out my Discord or my Patreon, or leave me a comment telling me what you are interested in seeing from me next. Let's start by looking back at the horror games released on the PlayStation 1. You've got the first 3 Resident Evils, of course, Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, and Dino Crisis. Then on the more obscure side of things, you've got things like Juggernaut, Overblood, Hell Knight, Galarians, and then all the weird Japanese exclusives like Moonlight Syndrome and The Note, as well as plenty of other pre-existing franchises brought over to the PlayStation 1 like Clock Tower and Alone in the Dark. While the PS2 offered far less new franchises compared to the 23 on PlayStation 1, it's actually all the more impressive we even got as many as we did, considering the value publishers see in sequels, of which we did get lots and lots of during this generation. We had 4 Silent Hill games, 6 Resident Evil games, as well as nearly a dozen sequels to IP established either before or during the 6th generation. By the dawn of the 7th generation, both the market, developers, and publishers all seemed deeply invested in horror titles, with the 5th and 6th generations boasting a total of 90 or so horror titles released on Sony consoles, with 37 of them being new IP, and the PS2 seeing a 36% increase in horror titles over the PS1. Okay, so how many games were on the PS3? Well, this is where things become much harder to calculate as the lines between genres begin blurring tremendously around this time. So in the interest of transparency, I'm going to be listing all of the games that I have found to be listed as horror games on various wikis, forums, and so on. Then we'll see how many are left upon filtering them through my gracious genre definition, of which I will not be sharing with you because we are not having that conversation. I've been a part of enough emo and metal fandoms to know that the genre can of worms is one that is never worth opening. Before filtering the games through my unarguable and unclarified definition of what a real horror game is, we have a total of 11 new IPs and 36 games total. But before we settle on this number, let's take a closer look at what this list really entails, beginning with new IP. These are the games I have identified as being the first or sole entries of a new IP, most notably of which being The Last of Us, Dead Space, Dead Island, and Fear. The list of PS3 horror titles that aren't first installments include 2 Silent Hill games, far more integral to this list than the fandom itself, 2 Fear sequels, 3 Dead Space sequels, 2 Saw games, 2 Dead Island sequels, the second Condemned game but not the first despite the first being released on the 360, 9 Resident Evil sequels, and a multitude of 8th generation console titles that were downgraded for a PS3 release, such as Alien Isolation, Resident Evil Revelations 2, and The Evil Within. Okay, so some of you may be looking at this list and having some thoughts. Is Last of Us really a horror game? I don't know, it felt more like a cool cinematic adventure with horror elements. It definitely has some scary moments, but is it a horror game? Fear? Isn't that a first-person shooter? Well, it does have a creepy girl in it, and Wikipedia lists it as a psychological horror. Well, actually, no, it refers to it as a first-person shooter psychological horror game. But, I mean, Dead Island definitely isn't scary, but Dead Space, surely Dead Space is a horror game. Okay, that was just a little cheeky fun. Dead Space is definitely a horror game. Something's a little off about these games, isn't there? They all seem to carry a caveat of sorts in regards to genre placement, don't they? Welcome to horror gaming on the PlayStation 3. There were many examples of horror gaming that predate the PlayStation, with the first being often cited as Haunted House on the Magnavox Odyssey, released in 1972. Haunted House wasn't necessarily a video game in how we'd understand one today, but rather a method in which to downgrade your expensive tube television into a really heavy light bright by placing a laminate overlay onto your TV screen. I'd love to go into the gameplay, but even watching people play it and read the directions, I honestly have no idea what's going on here. From here, we would get a variety of games marketed as horror released onto various consoles, but a lot of them were text-based adventures that were only released for Apple and MS-DOS, like Mystery House and The Lurking Horror. But I think the most interesting prehistoric example of horror gaming is 3D Monster Maze for the Sinclair ZX81.
Right! Ford is this protein son of a bee! That's gray! That's not good!
With most of the more popular early horror titles like Alone in the Dark being confined to PC and Sweet Home not having released a translation stateside, things didn't really start moving on consoles until much later, when one game would release and completely upend the entire genre forever. Okay, no, it was Resident Evil. Obviously, the game that changed everything and brought horror gaming into the mainstream, selling over 1 million copies in its first 6 months of release, was Resident Evil. While it didn't exactly create the genre of survival horror outright, it did bring it to modern audiences and made it mainstream. Resident Evil was as mainstream as any other game of its era. It outsold Crash Bandicoot, Donkey Kong Country 3, Super Mario RPG, and was only a few 100,000 copies away from outselling Tekken 2 and Super Mario 64 worldwide. Once Resident Evil strapped f***ing jet engines onto the PlayStation 1, sending them flying out of store windows and into your f***ing head at supersonic speed, other horror games inevitably started popping up pretty quickly, all salivating for a taste of that Jill sandwich. In the mid-90s, the PlayStation was greenlighting horror games like Netflix was greenlighting shows in 2020.
This show is about a girl named Ginny.
Yes, here's money. Go, make it.
But just like Netflix, publishers may have gotten their thumbs a little too stuck to the take-all button, and come the PS2, the genre had a bit of an over-encumbrance problem. The PlayStation 2 is my favorite and, coincidentally, objectively the greatest console to ever hit store shelves, and with the console having by far the greatest games library of all time, you bet your ass we were getting horror games. However, you may be surprised to know that many of them didn't do as well as you may have expected, and you'd probably be even more surprised to know how many of them you didn't even know existed in the first place. Likely most of them. Well, unless you're a fan of this channel, in which case you're a very informed and smart little guy. But for most people, if you were to bring up games like The Suffering, or Extermination, or Lifeline, Rule of Rose, Haunting Ground, or Clock Tower 3, they'd probably have no idea what you're talking about. I can't believe I did that. At the very most, maybe they've heard of a couple or somewhat remember seeing some of those on store shelves back in the day, but that would probably be about it. Contrast that to, say, Resident Evil or Silent Hill, which most people have a much clearer idea of. And yeah, a big part of that is thanks to the movies and various other types of media those games crawled into. They wouldn't have been able to do that had the games themselves not had been as successful as they were. I mean, I think Nightmare Creatures is badass as fuck, but the most it ever got from greater pop culture was a soundtrack by Rob Zombie for the sequel. That said, however, there are a multitude of games you and I, as fucking nerds, may deem as classics that were released on the PlayStation 2, but they weren't actually that successful and didn't really do all that well in the grand scheme of things. By the end of the 6th generation, we can kind of see a bit of a dwindling of the proverbial flame, and future entries of previous genre giants begin to lose their footing. Silent Hill 2 and 3 did pretty well. Code Veronica did okay, but not great, which is probably part of Capcom's trepidation about making a remake, but Haunting Ground, Siren, Michigan Michigan Report from Hell, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, Kuon, Fatal Frame 2, Obscure 2, Fatal Frame 3, The X-Files, Resist or Serve. Much of these games are plenty beloved and have very strong communities holding them up, but the reason the communities are there to support them in the first place is because they weren't supported by anyone else. That isn't to say there were no big hits on the console. We did, of course, get some smash hits like Resident Evil 4 and Silent Hill 2, but Silent Hill 2 didn't actually perform as well as we would have assumed, and I can use capitalism to prove it. This is how expensive a complete in-box copy of Resident Evil 4 is, and how expensive a copy of Greatest Hits re-release for the PS2 is. The GameCube version, the PS3 version. Okay, you get it. RE4 was incredibly successful, but what of Silent Hill 2? Okay, and the Greatest Hits re-release? What? For a Greatest Hits? Okay, in fairness, this price makes a little bit more sense when you remember that the HD remasters of Silent Hill 2 and 3 are universally panned, thus driving up the demand for the original game, but RE4 has been ported to every goddamn platform known to man and several known to monkey. Okay, sure, so Silent Hill 2 has less supply and more demand than RE4, but it was still successful, selling over a combined total of 1 million copies across North America, Europe, and Japan, and as much as 2.5 million copies when combining Xbox and PC sales. But why is this so important? People still bought horror games, 1 million people is still a lot, and games like Siren and Fatal Frame spawned numerous sequels. We had plenty of successful horror games, just not as successful as Resident Evil 4.
More. I'm not sated. Feed me more.
If video game history has taught us anything, it's that any success less than the success of the most successful game of the era is not successful enough. But you're right, not everyone can be Resident Evil 4, this is true. Understanding the sauce that went into that game and made it taste so fucking good is a Herculean task that no one but the folks in charge of the remake of the game itself could ever manage to achieve. But maybe the publishers didn't need to know what was in the sauce. Maybe they just needed to know what they thought made it taste so good to the customers eating it up in monolithic numbers. But maybe it wasn't being a Resident Evil game that made it so good. There was something different about RE4 that sent the sales numbers into the stratosphere, and it wasn't the zombies. There aren't even zombies in that game. Then they got it.
Hasta luego.
Snappy, revolutionary, endlessly replayable, face-kicking, knife-fighting, statue-chasing, minecart racing action. Action isn't everything, but it does make a game easier to sell to a mass audience, and as we'll discuss more in a bit, selling to the largest possible audience was particularly important for any game released on the PlayStation 3. It took some time before we'd actually begin seeing the results of this epiphany, so while action and horror began courting one another, something else was happening in the industry that would bolster the boners of every publisher on the planet. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was released in 2007 and sold over 3 million copies, in third place only behind We Play and Halo 3. Now, I could spend a lot of this video discussing Call of Duty, the hold it had on the industry and the effects of which we still feel to this very day, but I've never really played a Call of Duty game due to a debilitating condition of mine known as good taste. She's here now, wearing all of the squirrels that I stapled onto her body. This game's so good. Okay, so maybe not good taste, but the Call of Duty games were just never for me. But they were for lots and lots of other people, because to date, the franchise has sold over 425 million units worldwide, with much of this success occurring during the 7th generation. Adding up just the games released on the PS3, those being COD 3, World at War, the Modern Warfare and Black Ops trilogies, Ghosts, and Advanced Warfare, you've got over 225 million sales. As impressive as these numbers are, it wasn't just the success of a singular franchise that caused a massive shift in the industry around this time, but the rise of the first-person shooter genre in general. With Halo, Battlefield, Borderlands, and many others, the FPS genre was taking serious hold in this generation, largely due to online multiplayer becoming the new normal for console gamers, and especially casual console gamers. However, it wasn't FPS games alone that caused horror games to take a backseat during these years either. For example, here are some of the best-selling games released during the final 3 years preceding the launch of the PS3. You've got your single-player stuff like GTA, Resident Evil 4, Final Fantasy, and while the trend of online multiplayer is definitely taking hold, things are relatively spread out across genres, all things considered. Now let's move over to the first 3 years of the PlayStation 3. We have a lot of what you would have expected here, lots of multiplayer FPS stuff, Halo 3, Modern Warfare, but there's another really big piece of this puzzle we haven't spoken of yet, which is the Nintendo Wii. Now, Nintendo has never been known for being supportive of horror as a genre in general, and they don't necessarily play the biggest role instrumentally in what I see as the downfall of horror gaming. However, I do believe that the domination of Wii sales during this era is incredibly indicative of the next big piece of evidence we have to talk about in the death of horror gaming, which is an overall changing of trends and an overall sense of newness brought forward by this generation's consoles. Around this time, we begin seeing a multitude of new trends coming along with the 7th generation, many of which just couldn't find homes within the horror genre and definitely not within the strict confines of the survival horror genre. With new, much more powerful consoles, along with the new advent of user-created content, games like Little Big Planet and Minecraft started opening the space up for more inventive and flexible play types. More realistic graphics means more realistic situations and deeper storytelling. Horror movies are all well and cool, but they don't win Oscars. While the Silent Hill series has always exhibited mature storytelling to a large degree, with their multifaceted narratives and questions of morality and psychological torment, as well as perhaps a few other games like Rule of Rose, it's not really a genre often renowned for its storytelling. You and I can mention a bunch of great stories within horror games, sure, but obviously we weren't the market in this era. They wanted to go bigger, more cinematic, and more casual. Uncharted, Tomb Raider, Far Cry, Heavy Rain, Jason, Red Dead Redemption, these all play to a much wider audience, will sell many more copies, and all contain elements that weren't as much a part of gaming in previous generations. Speaking of Far Cry, the 7th generation is also where Ubisoft went from being a development studio to a verb. We used to say Ubisoft made this game, and now we say these people Ubisofted the fuck out of this game and now I hate it! The light RPG trend had begun before Ubisoft would strangle it to death for the following decades, but for better or worse, they had managed to get the formula down better than anyone else, or at least the most accessible version of that formula. And while games like Far Cry and Assassin's Creed had things like skill trees, side quests, parkour, outposts, the worst driving mechanics you've ever seen, and more map markers than your body has room for, they also had easy to follow, often compelling, action-packed narratives that anyone from your little sister to your dead grandmother could follow along with. Today, these things are generally regarded as being equally as exhausting as they are exhausted, but in the late 2000s, this was fucking awesome. These mechanics and gameplay loops served as a great way to immerse players while keeping them on the edge of their seats and maintaining a solid momentum throughout the game's playtime. But on the other side of the shiny, piss-filtered, and way too saturated open world that is the 7th generation were Western RPGs. Fallout, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, Deus Ex, RPGs that even your older brother with the eyebrow piercing and 5-finger death punch CD could like. Of course, we've already talked about multiplayer, and while we would eventually begin figuring out how to make multiplayer work in horror games later with the asymmetrical multiplayer boom brought forth in games like Dead by Daylight and Friday the 13th, as well as viral hits like Phasmophobia and Lethal Company, it would take some time before we got there, and in the meantime, we mainly just get co-op campaigns like that of RE5 and Dead Rising 2, and while Xbox players would get to experience the Left 4 Dead series, which I personally think are some of the best examples of co-op horror the entire generation saw, they still left quite a bit to be desired from a horror perspective. Oh, quick side note, Back 4 Blood also left quite a bit to be desired, but you should go play it, because I think Back 4 Blood is actually really good, and it's not very good, but it's really fun sometimes. Please play Back 4 Blood with me. Then you've got the Wii.
Nintendo.
The console responsible for releasing the best-selling games of the generation and bridging the gap between children and adults alike, often even with the same games. Sure, the kiddos will love Wii Fit and Super Smash Brawl, but so does everyone else, as evidenced by them being 2 of the top 3 best-selling games of 2008, with the third being GTA 4. And while we did have peripherals with things like Guitar Hero and Rock Band that did pretty well on the previous gen, nothing compares to the nature of the Wii and how well well they handled peripherals. So with all these new options and the landscape of gaming becoming more casual, more Western, and much more expensive, what were horror games up to? With all these new changes, horror had to keep up and it had to adapt. And with all these changing interests coinciding with the cost of development increasing, publishers were not interested in taking risks. But we did still get some horror games, and the results are smushing different trends into horror games. And I'm going to go through a few of the more notable ones here. We have BioShock, a game that in my opinion would have been better suited as a horror game and honestly spends most of its playtime in a dizzying tonal argument between horror and action, throwing just as many enemies and mini-games at you as it does brilliant storytelling and immersive environments. Look, I have bad opinions on BioShock. I know this, I won't mention it again. We have The Last of Us holding down the fort for the more mature storytelling trend and honestly doing an amazing job. The Last of Us is one of my favorite games of all time, and I think it does a really good job holding on to a horror identity with its intentional scenarios where the player has to think critically about things like ammo and healing items, plenty of stressful stealth situations and jump scares, while still providing a beautifully crafted and acted story. Great job! Maybe not such a great job to Deadly Premonition, another more mature storytelling type game that, while generally seen as a so bad it's good game or even just bad altogether,
I can't believe it. This is fantastic. Olivia, I'm sorry, but can I change my order? I'll have what Harry's having.
it's definitely a game that has its fans, and it's earned a very solid cult audience around it. Dead Space is following both the mature storytelling and action shooter trends, essentially making for a scarier Resident Evil 4 in space. And I don't have to tell you how incredible this game is, right? It definitely falls victim to some shortcomings of the era, something that is all more apparent in the remake, which I wish would have been updated for some of those things, but that's okay. It's f***ing Dead Space. Dead Space kicks ass. And it would continue kicking ass with its tasteful blend of action and horror in the sequel, then completely shit the bed with Dead Space 3, which would kill the franchise, driving yet another nail into the coffin of the genre with its mishmash of lost genre identity, multiplayer, and action-focused gameplay that tried to appeal to everyone and ended up appealing to no one.
Tale as old as time.
Condemned 2 Bloodshot is a great horror game that is more along the lines of what we would have previously expected from a survival horror game, albeit with a bit more action, but only the sequel made it to PS3, which was common for the time due to how difficult and expensive it was to develop games for the PS3 thanks to the tangled architecture of the Cell processor.
The Cell processor at the heart of the PlayStation 3 wasn't designed with gaming in mind. As a matter of fact, Sony wasn't even in the picture when work on Cell started.
So there's another reason we got so few horror games on the PS3. Alan Wake, Rise of Nightmares, Left 4 Dead, and plenty more never made it over to the PS3. Fear is pretty much just a first-person shooter with some neat narrative horror elements painted over it. Vampire Reign is similar, but fucking awful. Dead Rising doesn't even count. Evil Within is maybe the most true-to-form survival horror game the PS3 ever saw, but it was a PS4 game downgraded to the PS3, so it's hard to count that one. Even though I want to, because Evil Within is incredible. Okay, we're starting to fall apart a little bit here. Let's see where the previously established IPs were at this time. I mean, there were 9 fucking Resident Evil games released on the PS3, so surely between 9 games, there has to be at least one that was a good horror game, right? Well, sort of. With Resident Evil 4 having such impressive sales numbers, it naturally makes sense that Resident Evil 5 would become the action-packed thrill ride that it was, and stands out as another prime example of what was happening in the industry at that time. Call of Duty may be the easiest scapegoat in explaining why Resident Evil went the direction it did, with Modern Warfare releasing just 2 years before RE5. However, the truth is, this was the direction Resident Evil was heading in anyway, starting to push more towards action all the way back in 1999 with RE3 Nemesis. But with the advent of the co-op trend beginning to take serious hold in the industry, it made total sense that Capcom would push RE5 into an action-packed experience with co-op behind the wheel. Another compounding element to all of this, at least in relation to Capcom, was the rise of Monster Hunter, a game whose entire existence was thanks to Capcom's eagerness to get an early foot into online gaming. I'm way too stupid to enjoy Monster Hunter, but I hear it's a blast. Obviously, this further push into action, which was already controversial upon RE4's release amongst fans, would leave players largely divided, which is something Capcom would try and right somewhat with Revelations 1 and 2, which I think they did more or less accomplish. Revelations 1 was primarily developed for the 3DS, getting a port to pretty much everything soon after, and I really like these games. It's a tragedy we don't ever hear of the canon introduced in these games ever again. Like Terra Grigia. How is no one talking about Terra Grigia? An entire ocean city was wiped out and it's just not important anymore? The PS3 would also see the release of RE6, a game many would see as the final nail in the coffin of Resident Evil, and stands out to much of the fan base as the worst game of the franchise and one of the worst games ever made. Okay, quick timeout.
All kids out of the pool!
This is not a hot take. RE6 being a bad game is maybe the coldest take anyone could possibly make. There's a lot we could say about RE6, but I'm not going to kill that content for myself in this video as I'll be reviewing it properly somewhere down the line, but I can summarize and say the primary reason for the putridity of RE6 is its need to make everyone happy, which would result in a number of different campaigns, all of which were bad, all of which aimed at different styles of player. RE6 is a mess. Okay, so these are all the Resident Evil games released on the PS3. These are the ones I think are more horror games than not. So yeah, things weren't exactly going strong over in this department either. So that's Resident Evil, but what about Silent Hill? Silent Hill had one of the cleanest release records to date with 2, 3, and 4 on the PS2, and even managed to keep some fans around with Origins and Shattered Memories, regardless of their shortcomings. I am not an expert on Silent Hill, and I feel like to talk about Silent Hill, I need an expert. So I've asked my friend the Gaming Muse to stop in and give us a little bit of insight about where Silent Hill was at that time.
PS3 was hard to work for, to program for, to create games for. And I think that is reflected in how many different series, not just horror, really struggled in the PS3 era. Like once you start thinking about it, it really starts to make sense. And I think the best example in Silent Hill is Silent Hill Downpour. It's a fantastic game, and one of its biggest weaknesses is its programming. On launch, it had so many problems that, like, for some people, the game was literally unplayable. And I think that was a big part of why Downpour, especially in the beginning, had a really negative review score and negative feelings among fans because lots of folks couldn't even play it. Homecoming, I don't remember having as many programming errors or issues. I think a lot of its struggle was honestly just in the writing and the kind of trying to be a Silent Hill game. It has a lot of good going in it. There's some cool ideas in it that just aren't always executed well for Silent Hill. I think if it hadn't had Silent Hill in the title, it would probably just be considered a classic of like campy slasher horror. They had a period in probably late 90s, early 2000s where they stretched out really far. They created a lot of smaller companies, and I think they overstretched themselves, or they just decided they were going to focus in a different direction. And over the years, many of them were fused together or eventually just shuttered. And in around 2006 is when K-Set was finally hit. As a series, it really started to fumble solely because Konami was trying to figure out how to make the game succeed in a way that it was never going to, because that's not what Silent Hill is. Silent Hill is not Resident Evil. It is not an action game. It is never going to be an action game because Resident Evil already exists, and those fans are going to play that game, and Silent Hill fans are going to be upset if you make it less Silent Hill.
So there you have it. Between the changing trends, games becoming much more expensive and therefore studios taking less risks, the cell processor being a pain in the ass to develop for, and established franchises losing their footing in the shuffle, all of this accumulates to what I consider to be the reasons for why horror died in the 7th generation. However, things did not stay dead for very long. Jumping to the modern day, the genre is actually doing really well, not only on PC, where it's always had a better life than it did on consoles, it's also doing really well on consoles, boasting incredibly large numbers and multitudes of new horror games coming out every year that people really enjoy. This resurrection of sorts was largely thanks to games like Outlast, Alien Isolation, The Evil Within, Soma, Until Dawn, and Dead by Daylight, just to name a few. So before we knew it, horror began clawing its way through the dirt, and by the middle of the 8th generation, we had a large number of really solid horror games complete with their own unique identities. Single-player survival horror games, multiplayer scenarios, both asymmetrical and cooperative, cinematic on-rails experiences, all began coexisting, and before we knew it, horror games were back. In 2017, Resident Evil returned with Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, or Biohazard 7 Resident Evil for Japanese audiences, which I find really cute, but you know what wasn't cute? Fucking Resident Evil 7! This game was balls to the wall scary in a way nobody expected after the series' 1,000 deaths we'd witnessed some years before.
Stay out of here!
The camera perspective changed to first person, the pace slowed way down, inventory management and map clearing were gameplay focal points. Resident Evil was new, improved, and ready for a new generation of players and its old generation of players. The series would continue releasing bangers and remakes, all of which boasted incredibly large sales numbers and critical acclaim, bridging the gap between players new and old in a way I don't even think Capcom thought was possible. Now look, I'm not a Five Nights at Freddy's guy, but when we're talking about reaching a new generation of fans, nobody did it better, and we can't deny how important that series is to the genre. I was working with middle schoolers when Five Nights at Freddy's popped off, and I mean popped the f*** off, and like, yeah, I don't like those games, but I thought it was amazing to see all these 13-year-olds running around with Five Nights at Freddy's t-shirts, and like kids the same age 10 years prior were not running around in Fear t-shirts and asking each other if they bought Silent Hill Shattered Memories. These games had a reach further within horror gaming than anything I've seen in my lifetime, and regardless of how you may feel about the games, it is a success to be celebrated. I mean, hey, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Another thing we have to be conflictedly thankful for are the subscription models that Game Pass kicked off in this generation and PlayStation would drunkenly stumble into with PS Plus, both of which carried a multitude of horror options, furthering the manifest destiny of horror gaming into more homes. Visage is probably the scariest fucking game I've ever played, and had it not been on Game Pass, which it has been sadly removed from, I doubt I would have ever checked it out. So this method, while being pretty unhealthy for studios and developers in the long run, as we're witnessing now, did do a very efficient job of delivering these games to people who likely wouldn't have tried them before. So that's an admittedly brief summary on how horror gaming came back, but the details of its resurrection are just as dense and interesting as the details of its death. So if you're interested in a video on how it came back and the timeline with which it did so, let me know in the comments. There's definitely more to be discussed on that subject. But that's gonna do it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for sticking around. I'm not a scholar by any means, so I apologize if I got anything wrong. As I said earlier, this video serves as more of a vehicle with which to learn more about this subject, so if you have more to add to the conversation, please let me know in the comments. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Mr. Nobody and Sakura Blue, to the Gaming Muse for jumping in on another episode with me. Thank you all so much, and I'll smell you later.